Stress fractures, part 2, brought to you by Mobo. All right, so yesterday we talked about the fact of someone typically comes in and your doc says, sorry, you have a stress fracture. And the thing I want to make clear is I really don't care, okay? What I care is why you have a stress fracture. And let's talk about why you actually have a stress fracture. So when you look at what happens with bones, okay, bones and all tissues adapt to load. There's something called Wolff's Law, not like the wild wolf, but a researcher named Wolff, which basically says the more load you give to tissues, the more they adapt. And think about this as a dial, right? So if you do absolutely nothing, you lay in bed all day, your body gets weak. It gets death by disuse, okay? If you do way too much, you get death by overload, okay? Those of you who have overtrained have been here before. So what we want to think about is where's the healthy dose to be in, right? Think about the amount of work we're doing. I put intensity, but it's volume and intensity. If we are in a certain zone, we can sort of maintain our bone health, right? And we're sort of okay. If we push the needle and go further, we get into a beneficial zone where we actually improve our abilities, our body's ability to deal with impact loads to bones and also to yanking loads to bones. So we address those things we talked about yesterday as far as shock and as far as stability. But if we push too far, we wind up by what? Death by overload, where things tend to fall apart. So let's think about this for a second. People are variable, right? If we've got these two people, yes, they have the same shirts on, but they're both runners, and they come in and say, I'm having pain, right? And so we have to look at movement as well as form. And again, people are different. These people have different hairdos, same shirts, different hairdos, and they both run, cut, jump a little bit different. So what do? We test. It's pretty simple, right? So let's say you actually don't feel very well, right? And your doctor comes in and says, okay, we need to check if you're okay. I will draw some blood, right? And we draw blood, and then we find out that you are sick. Why? Because you have a lab test, right? We had some normal value. You are off that normal value, and therefore, again, you are sick. So again, we use lab tests all the time to look at things as far as internal, right? But I think that people don't understand we can also use lab tests to look at the variability of biomechanics, right? We can take fancy tools such as motion analysis systems, which allow us to go through and actually look at and record the way someone moves, the forces we see right and left, the timing of these things, right? And so we're left with data which shows forces, mechanical work, mechanical power, and range of motion, which give us a way to find out where things are and what's driving things, right? I can have someone come into a research lab and tell them very conclusively, your stress fracture is due to a problem with stability versus your stress fracture is due to a problem with lack of impact damping, right? So shock versus tensile force is easy to figure out in a lab. Honestly, it is. Now, it takes millions of dollars to get this equipment, but it's easy if you understand the data and know how to use it. Now, most of you don't have this. So what do we have, right? Well, we've also got this idea behind bodies, okay? And when you think about bodies, anatomy matters, right? So let's think about this. Not everybody has Charlie Brown heads, but I always draw them this way. But when you look at the way a body behaves, right, you've got a femur. A femur is a very big bone with a very big cross-sectional area. Think about this piece of wood. Here is another piece of wood that's the same length. That's what? Much thinner, okay? So if you think about it, this bone here can withstand not very much force before it breaks, right? This bone can withstand a whole lot of impact load before it's going to crack. So when someone comes in with a stress fracture identified on their femur, I always tell people the way you get a stress fracture on your femur is not by getting hit by a bus, right? It's not an impact problem because this bone can take a ton of impact. What happens rather is that the adductor muscles wrap around the bone, right? And they're constantly going yank, 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 yank. And this yanking, right, because you didn't have stability up in the proper muscles, up in the hip complex and through the quad and the hamstrings properly, so it forces you to over-dominate with your adductor muscles, because adductors are actually very powerful flexors and extensors of the hip. And so when you over-dominate from those adductor muscles, they wind up yanking, yanking, yanking. And remember yesterday, they crack the candy coating off M&Ms, right? So that's one type of stress fracture, again, that tensile stress fracture that's not due to impact at all, right? So don't think about every fracture is always impact. It's not, right? Let's converse that with what happens down in the foot, okay? So we think about our feet. So obviously when we run, most folks out there are actual heel strikers, right? It says calcaneus has a lot of impact load. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes we do see calcaneal stress fractures that are due to impact loads, okay? Let's contrast that with a navicular, right? Your navicular on the inside of the foot is never on the ground. It never touches, right? So what happens is you can see how this foot is twisting back and forth, right? If you don't have good torsional stability within the foot and ankle, this bone doesn't touch anything, right? And so this bone doesn't touch anything, but it constantly gets tweaked and tweaked and tweaked and tweaked. And what happens is it gets yanked apart, like we talked about. That's more of an instability problem. So again, we talked today about different types of ways to look at this stuff, right? We can use fancy equipment in a lab. We can also think about your anatomy, right? I'm not going to go through every one of these here. If you have questions on what bone tends to resolve in a stress fracture with overload due to shock versus overload due to instability, talk to your local therapist or physician. They should understand this. But my point I wanted to make here today, when those of you who have a stress fracture go to your physician and they put you in a boot or on crutches, that's fine. Temporary unloading that bone so it can heal is super, super, super helpful. However, again, we have to fix the why. If you don't fix the why, you'll never get better. And to sum it all up today, I want to thank everybody. The real reason why you guys are all here is to see what? Smashed M&Ms. Thanks.